Good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to the reveal of the ASCM Top 10 Trends in Supply Chain for 2025. My name is Matt Talbert. I'm the Senior Research Manager at ASCM. I am not the star of this show, but I will be moderating this event with three other experts. This will be more of an Ask Me Anything. I'm going to let our three panelists introduce themselves, give a brief introduction, kind of give us their take on the trends. And then after they go around, fire away your questions. Feel free in the meantime, let us know where you're tuning in from. I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves, and as you tell us who you are, why don't you give, your so what about the trends? Armand, why don't you start us off? You're the chair of the subcommittee that develops the trends.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Armand van Oostrom. I have a background in operations and supply chain as a consultant and a COO. I am now a senior lecturer at the Hague University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, and I do research into entrepreneurial ecosystem, which to me seems like a new word for supply chain. But maybe that's just me. You were saying my take on why do we talk about these trends?
Yeah,
So,
let's think, of our audience, why should they care about the trends?
yeah, just also thinking of my experience, you can get so bogged down into the day-to-day things that you think about tomorrow or maybe the day after or the next year if you're planning. The trends give you an opportunity to say, okay, what is next? What do we take into account? It kind of draws you into a longer term perspective, and it gives you an opportunity to sort out what is most important for us in our industry versus all the things you could be doing.
Hey, thank you, Armand. Lucille, why don't you go next?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in part of the world. My name is Lucille Doctor. I am a senior manager for supply chain planning at UScellular. So currently, I lead demand, supply, inventory planning, risk management, agility, and resilience efforts for our organization. Top 10 trends is one of the things I always look forward to from ASM and even other organizations that pulls this kind of information. Because for me, as a practitioner, it is important to be in the know. For us that are supply chain practitioners, we always have to think ahead to stay competitive, to be able to bring it to the front of our senior leaders. What are the things we need to prepare for? Maybe we are looking for some sort of innovation project or activities that we wanted to introduce to the organization. So these are some of the things. And then what's hot, what is happening. Later on, there will probably be some questions on what are the things we need to prepare for to remain ahead of the game. So these are some important things that I always wanted to be in the lookout.
Great, thank you, Lucille. Mike, you might be one of the few good evening people. It looks like nighttime where you're
It
tuning in
is.
from.
It's late. It's late afternoon with me, Matt. Uh, thank you, Matt. So, Mike Mowat, I run IBM's Consulting for Supply Chain and Operations in the UK and Ireland. I think the thing that really kind of hits home to me around the trends is it sets the tone of where we are and where we're going. I always get excited, as Lucille kind of referred to, when you start to look at these and start to say, well, what's the so what for me? And then what are we actually doing in these areas? So when we're actually then thinking about that future and the investments and what capabilities do we need, it's then starting to say, well, what's informing those? And I feel that the association's annual report on around the trends really helps focus the attention there.
Great, thank you, Mike. And without further ado, I will reveal the 2025 top 10 trends in supply chain. So before I open up the floor to start, you could start throwing your questions in the LinkedIn live chat. I will see them. I will be able to throw them to our panel. I'll sort of give my so what from the perspective of ASCM staff. These trends help sort of guide some of our content for the year. Maybe some sessions we might not want to pick at our Change conference in both Europe and North America, webinars, white papers, and such. One thing I want to kind of discuss in terms of these trends is there's a lot that goes into them that's more than just, hey, let's hop on a Zoom call and discuss it for an hour. As you know, Armand, as the chair, there's a lot of work that goes into them. It's very rigorous and they hold up to scrutiny. There is a deep literature review that takes about a month, and then a 2 months long trends extraction from the literature that they have found, then lots of discussion over combining sub-trends, and then a final vote. And this is where they fall in the line. And we only have 3 of the members of the subcommittee that have developed this. So on the panel here, there's a group of over 20 people that help develop these trends on an annual basis. Armand, as chair, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add in terms of the process and sort of the scrutiny that goes into it.
Well, I think it offers a truly global view, and yes, to a certain extent, you will see within continents and even within Europe that there are, let's say, differences in the way people rank things. But if we then look at let's say, the stats of what is how people rank, you see that there's a strong convergence. So that brings us to conclude that the listing we have here is really based on the consensus within that group.
Hey, thank you, Armand. First question I'm seeing. So digital integration and connectivity, how is that sort of distinctive from, say, big data and analytics, for example? Mike, I might throw that question to you if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think I go back to the kind of definitions around what these are, and it's about that kind of, as you kind of go for the efficiency, visibility, and resilience, is how do you bring these all together? Because when we're talking big data, right, we're focusing on that data and the analytics element and how that comes together. But it's actually all the kind of stitching, and also how do we kind of go cross companies? How do we collaborate across? How do we bring all these different capabilities with all the magic buzzwords we all love? How do these all kind of come together in a way that then we can then surface the kind of data and analytics behind it? That's really, for me, the kind of crucial thing. And it's one of the things as we move forward, as we look into the future of supply chain, is all these different applications that we're looking at. On an average day, someone could be looking at over 10 plus applications a day, opening and closing them 40 times. You start to think about this and it's like, well, wait a minute, how do we integrate this? Is there a better way we can do this that will then help us focus on the kind of being proactive and focusing on what needs to be done, rather than all this kind of time we're spending in and out of different systems, and how we're seeing information from here and we're seeing information from there. But how do we get to that single source of truth, and how do we connect it all? It's probably how I look at it, Matt.
Hey, thanks.
Can I just build
Yeah,
on
go ahead.
what Mike just said? If we think of connectivity, there's a lot of data that runs along the supply chain, and just as one example is digital product passports. So those are passports that are, it's a bit like when you enter a country, all you need to give is the passport and all the data is in there that's verified. So that takes away all the needless checking and entering between organizations. To some extent, there's product coding, but the passport would give a platform across, it would provide a standard for data exchange. So it's starting to become real, but we're seeing the first applications already.
Great, thank you very much. There's more of a comment. Global trade and geopolitical policies, number 2, wasn't on the top 10 list in 2023. I believe last year that it was on the top 10 under a different name, geopolitical deglobalization of supply chains. But I know actually all 3 of you were on the subcommittee last year. Do you maybe want to kind of, this is the time for nuance and hair splitting, maybe kind of discuss the changes, why maybe we called it global trade dynamics and geopolitical policies, but kind of renamed it from, deglobalization of supply chains and geopolitical policies.
I can chime in first in my observation
Sure.
over the last 3 years, really. So our responses and the practitioners are reacting to what is happening. So the first 2020 to 2022, the crisis in COVID was the focus. So the reactions are really on the supply chain practitioner are heavy on that. And after wars and then starting to see the impact of tariffs and other manufacturing shifts, companies are starting to feel the pressure more of doing something about. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn on the light in this room. So we saw a big increase in interest from the respondents, even in academic studies or surveys, and what are the things that industries have to be on the lookout for on globalization or trade and tariff constraints. It's understanding this global trade and shift towards local sourcing, the rise of that really sparked more of the prominence of why suddenly it's suddenly number 2. And just now, with new administration in the United States, I'm pretty sure next year it's even going to be a hotter topic. Just personally in my organization, as our leaders prepare, I provide some insight already. I inquire from our vendors, how are you preparing in the event tariff 2.0 is happening? How are you preparing for that? So the events, the events that are happening in this in the industry has heavily impacted on the sudden jump of this from previously not even part in 2023, number 8 in 2023, and then not for this year it's second place.
Yeah. And to the commenter's point, I think the major attention point is it shot up to number 2 on the list. And this was completed before the election. It was a hot topic. It was sensed very well by the Sensing Subcommittee, if I may say so. But even more so now, to your point, Lucille, it's going to play a major factor over the next couple of years. I have another question, unless Armand and Mike, you wanted to touch on that?
Well, maybe I can make a distinction between things that you can almost foresee happening and things you can prepare for. So I think it's called Mercosur Treaty, which is a number of countries in South America, and they've now established a treaty with the EU, and the treaty has been in the making for 25 years. For 25 years. So those are the things you can almost see coming. If you talk about climate change, we know it's going to hit, but we don't know exactly which areas are hit most. So that is where policies come in that will affect our supply chains. And so, to some extent, you can foresee those, and to some extent, you will have to go on what is our risk assessment about the situation, and we start preparing now.
Thank you, Armand. This next one, it's a twofold question, but it's a good one. So there's two parts. One is about AI in the labor force. Obviously, everyone's thinking about it. How will the labor force relate to AI? How will they adapt? And then the second is, what are some of the constraints companies or enterprises might face when adopting certain forms of AI? So we have sort of from that individual perspective, let's kind of cut those in half. From the individual perspective, I feel like what's being asked is, a robot or AI going to take my job, or is it going to be a tool? Mike, I'm going to throw, actually Armand, because I know beforehand we discussed that was one of your hot topics.
I'm sure Mike has a very good take on it. I'm just going to give you an example that Boston Dynamics has now a proof of concept of a robot doing what used to be manual work. So the proof of concept is there for robotics, AI to take over, because it's not a let's say traditionally programmed robot. It will use images and compare that and learn from what it's doing. Now, will it take away jobs? Well, it will take away that kind of job. The tension is between how do we transition? How do we take our current labor force from what they're doing now to jobs that oversee that kind of robotics? And that's not an easy feat. To my knowledge, there's not a course you can follow. And suddenly, but maybe that's my own experience, HR departments have to come to terms that this is not about contracts and T's and C's and bums on seats. This is how do we develop our personnel from the shop floor to the board of directors. So the two answers there. One, it will replace jobs. And two, we have to get things in gear, because otherwise that uncertainty will play a role in how our organization functions. If we don't take away that uncertainty, people on the shop floor will make their lives even harder, I would say. But Mike, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Oh, yeah, Mike, why don't you give us your take?
Yeah, I suppose we differ a little bit in our view there, Armand. I think where the perspective I come from is what is changing around labour, right? And how we're going to adapt to AI. I'm kind of looking at it from perspective of AI is there, whether it be as assistance, whether it be taking out some of those kind of manual, repetitive activities. But let's not get carried away here. We're going to still need the brains and the intellect and the curiosity and challenge of our supply chain professionals to look at information and make decisions. What I think will change will be how we get that information to us to help us and make us more informed. From an example, I'm doing something right now with a client, which is around how do you look at all the previous change requests that you've had in relation to scheduling something, being able to get that information quickly to you to then help, right, we did this the last time, or we did that. Why did we do that? We did this because of X, Y, and Z. It's going to have to be explainable. And I am in a position where I agree with Yossi Sheffi, who's MIT on this, who's written a book, not to plug his book, but in the sense of, yes, some jobs will change. I'm not suggesting for a moment they would, but as long as you've still got that kind of need for decision making and the need for looking at ambiguity and responding to that, I'm sorry, my view is we're alive and kicking in supply chain, and we're going to be around for a hell of a long time doing this kind of stuff, in my opinion.
Hey, thank you both. This is a good one. Regarding strategic sourcing and supplier management, do you see this as a reaction to the nearshoring effort post-COVID and triggered by global trade dynamics, given the possible increase in tariffs on key goods? Lucille, that has your name written all over it.
Yes, it is definitely one of the drivers, although it is a culmination of a lot of things. I mean, strategic sourcing has existed for a long time, but there's a heightened focus on that most recently to what Katie has pointed out there, a reaction to the impact of COVID. Companies are more risk averse in having that redundancy or supplier diversification. So now category management or procurement are making sure that this is a prime focus, that we have that risk mitigation plan, but also at a risk right now with the technology evolution, integrating AI and other data driven decisions. There is a risk on cybersecurity. So these are some of the things that are talked about when the topic of or the category of strategic sourcing and supplier management becomes prominent again on the top 10 trends. It's becoming a hot topic again because we're talking about making sure that vendors are being vetted correctly, making sure that with back to the topic of trade policies and nearshoring or reshoring, making sure that suppliers are within reach, especially over the past few years, the vulnerability of China concerned a lot of companies. So yes, the strategic sourcing topic, one of the drivers is a reaction from what companies had to endure over the first 2 years since COVID. And then it has evolved to what are the other things then that we have to take into consideration when we're thinking about having vendors and suppliers.
Hey, thank you, Lucille. I could help tee up this next one and then pass it off to the rest of you. This is part of the discussion that takes place behind the curtain. So digitization has dropped from number 1 in 2024 to 7 in 2025. Is that because digitization is now well advanced and old news? So part of the way I could help answer that, and then I'll pass it off to the experts. So it was digital supply chain that was number 1. And in discussions when we were trying to get the final list of trends ready for a vote to the subcommittee, we all kind of decided that digital supply chain was too broad a topic, very well adopted. So old news, I'll let the rest of you answer that. And no one could really define what it is. And if you remember when we presented on these at our most recent conference in Austin, Texas, I asked the audience, raise your hand if you've heard of digital supply chain. The whole room went up, all the hands went up. And then I asked, now keep your hand up if you could define what it is. Every single hand went down. So we kind of broke up digital supply chain into other trends. Now on that, more of the nuance, is it old news? What do we call it now? Mike, I'm going to start you off that one, being sort of the data whiz in the room.
Matt, no, I'm not a data whiz. I'm sure there's some very much more data whizzes. I think this is the challenge, and it will continue to be the challenge every year, is because we try and find a term to coin, and this is where the descriptions actually really help the user when you're reviewing the thing. I think it's moved on in the sense of it's now broken out into separate kind of areas, and I think that's probably the key thing. I mean, I kind of look at this list as this. You could start to consolidate a few of these, but it's almost kind of, well, what angle are we trying to take? And that's where the definitions for me, Matt, come in helpful. And I think personally, digitization, or whatever you want to call it, around technology is an enabler that will be on this, should be on this for a very long time in different disguises, because capability wise, we're starting to stitch up supply chains much better. People talk about a single source of truth. People kind of talk about the things like blockchain that went through Amara's law. We've got Gen AI, technology in some shape or form, however we want to define it. It will be here and will be here with us as we continue to evolve our supply chains into that kind of next generation.
Thank you, Mike. And one thing that you mentioned that was important, and our social media manager at ASCM, Tim Petrowski, has posted a link to the report in the chat here. There are definitions for all these trends. This trends report is very unique in that the subcommittee does very diligently write a definition for each of these. So if you really want to dig in for more nuance later, you could access that report that has come out today. Next question. Where does recycling sustainability fit in this spectrum? In some situations, we do not have an end user as much as a cyclical situation where the end product is recycled. There's still so much waste product. How do we change this beyond saying we need to recycle? This is more of like the circularity sustainability element, which is visibly absent from this list, perhaps embedded in other trends. Armand, I'm going to throw that to you first, just because I see a head nod.
Well, the head nod is also because Lucille and I had a little discussion in Austin during the Connect conference, and we were looking at it from two different angles. One is there are organizations for whom this is almost integrated in the way they do things. So they've got no waste to landfill policies, they're implementing it, and for them, it's no longer on the top list. Lucille pointed out, look, to some extent, organizations are also stumbling into major roadblocks. So it not being up there could also signal that some companies are losing faith is a big word, but they're losing faith that they can actually make that circularity work and work in a way that still lets them be competitive. If you think about circularity, and I think the person posing the question hinted towards that, it is a supply chain challenge. If you think of that your design should actually reflect that circularity, that ability to recycle stuff, reuse stuff, then you know how far back you need to go within your supply chain and how far you need to go downstream towards your outlets, your sales outlets, and your final consumer, because they will have to be able to return products. So it is still within our longer list, but I think those are the two reasons we had for saying it's not as top of mind as these 10. Did I get that right, Lucille?
Yes. So to pile on to what Armand just shared, right now it is still in the considerations. However, there's still a struggle in balancing that. It's actually layered in as ESG and not just sustainability or circularity. In other nomenclatures called ESG or circular supply chain, but the increasing pressure to make sure that the ESG goals and the profitability of organization are balanced, and setting up to a very sustainable supply chain requires a lot of infrastructure. It is a lot of investment, and it's hard to justify those investments right now. So a lot of organizations are stuck in putting effort on this, however, not being able to justify it to their organization. And just I pointed this out in Austin that the world is trying, but we plateaued. We got into a point where how can we take it to the next level? let's say for carbon footprint, if we wanted a EV operating environment, our roads are not ready. We do not have the power grids. How is the ethical sourcing to make sure the raw materials that you supply an EV vehicle is there? So these are the things that we are now still trying to navigate and make sure that we are staying true to what the sustainability and ethical sourcing is driving for.
Thank you, Lucille. Sort of along the sustainability topic, but a little different. This one's more logistics focused. With electrification transforming the fleet and supply chain industry, how have businesses responded to integrating EVs into their distribution networks, particularly given their strong focus on bottom line management? Lucille, I might keep that answer with you if you have anything that you could respond to that question with.
I did ask this question at a conference I attended earlier this year because we have Department of Transportation in the panel, 3PL carriers, and the topic of the electrification of our vehicles, a more smart vehicles. It was an ambitious thing we have been driving for over 10 years, probably 20 years, to get into that ideal state. The companies are, like I have shared, technology is there. It's not evenly spread out. While the innovation is there, it's not evenly spread out. There are some that might be ahead of the game, and that is because that is their primary focus. Maybe you are a 3PL provider, or maybe that is the number one value proposition of your organization. But majority of us that are typical organizations, we are still waiting to see how it's going to play out. So patiently listen, watching, working out, I did ask the question of how is the government supporting these efforts to make sure it happens? Are we doing something on making sure we're changing the regulations on the road? Are we investing on our road surfaces because an electronic vehicle is much heavier than a usual car? If you are putting an electronic vehicle right now on the road and all of them are electronic vehicle, our roads are going to crack. They're heavier. These EVs have heavier parts. So these are the things that a lot of us are observing and waiting to see how it's going to materialize. So a lot of waiting games still. It's quite ambitious for us to want it to be an EV world 2030.
Yeah, to
Thank
some
you.
extent,
Yeah.
there seems to be more movement in the last mile. So smaller vehicles, that turnaround seems to come around a bit more quickly. But what Lucille pointed out earlier, it's policies and things that require large-scale investments like the grid. That's not convincing yet to convince organizations to go full out.
Hey, thank you, Armand. Can you say more about number 9, workforce evolution? What are some aspects you at ASCM are seeing there? So I'll answer quickly the second part of that question. Is the ASCM staff person here? I'll let you all touch on the first part. So a couple things is the supply chain is changing so rapidly that we have a need for these trends to see what's going to happen within the next 2 to 3 years. So these trends do get incorporated into our certification update process. But also in getting certified, you are able to stay ahead of the game knowing that these trends are incorporated and stay in touch with an ever-changing field. We do have a newer certification certified in supply chain transformation, CTSC. There's a great need for supply chain transformation today. That is sort of the call that we answered. I wanted to be brief in my answer and sort of let the panel get into the substantive element. What do you mean by workforce evolution. Armand, I'm going to throw that one to you first.
Perhaps I'm just going to take a live example that I found really striking. In the Netherlands, I think in Western Europe, we're switching to heat exchangers rather than gas generated warming in houses. Now, all of these are different brands, the different builds. So if it comes down to maintenance, there's an enormous shortage of mechanics. And nowadays, it's not just electrical, but you have to also know how things are built. So if you think of augmented reality, how that can come in is that no longer do you need as a mechanic to know all of these brands and how they're built. You know the basics, but augmented reality, when you're at the work spot, can help you identify parts, and do the diagnosis for you, and also suggest ways to resolve the issue. So if you think of workforce evolution, these are now people that not just master technology itself, but they are also able or enabled by the new technology. It actually requires another way of looking at the way jobs are done. I've taken a maintenance example, but I think you could find more examples on the shop floor. And I think Mike also gave an example of what is happening in planning, where information now comes to people in a different way, in a different format, and it requires them to assess the data and take decisions in another way than they did before.
Hey, thank you, Armand.
I'll
Mike
go
or
on to that
Lucille?
again,
Yeah, go ahead.
Matt. So a couple of things, or maybe more than two, to Armand's point, the digitization of the world and the human coexistence is one of the main drivers of the workforce evolution. They have to work together with all these new innovations, this new technology that the workforce will have to deal with. It's not just about how to operate them. To Armand's point again, knowing what to do with this data. So the workforce will need to be trained to have that broad skill for informed decision making, especially in our industry and supply chain. Data is huge. Data is mine. Data is everything. You got this set of data that are coming in, what to do about it. Another thing for the workforce evolution is moving away from that just subject matter expertise in one area. There is a need for that flexibility or dexterity to be able to do something else aside from just doing that one thing. If you're heavy on inventory planning, it's a balance of analytical skills and that ability to manage that information. And then the changing landscape also on the demographics of the workforce. We do have maybe a set of generation that are close to retirement, and then a big pile of incoming talents, so that knowledge transfer or that experience transfer. So these are the things that we are seeing as we were chewing into the information on the workforce evolution that's driving the focus to upskill, reskill, train, and have any new sorts of knowledge.
Great, thank you, Lucille. Let's take a couple more, because we're almost 40 minutes in. How is China impacting global supply chains with its industrial policies such as Made in China 2025? And how is this shaping the 10 trends? In your research, did any of you see that as a factor when we came to the final top 10 ultimately?
I can jump in. So I mentioned earlier the vulnerability of China. The Belt Road Initiative is one of the very big initiative. It's kind of the modern Silk Road of converging different countries into a more free trade, a more advanced trading system. However, the Belt Road Initiative have necessitated a lot of investment in manufacturing, and also China has an aging workforce, um, and the economy is very volatile in China. So these are things that companies are getting more leery or keen about. And one thing that I came across, stumbled really over the past 2 years, it's that shift from getting it from China to Mexico. So this vulnerability of China unfolds, um, companies trying to see if they can go by going to Mexico to circumvent any tariff or the risks that are they're seeing in China. So that's are some of the things that, based on publications, based on actual responses or interactions, that companies are very cautious about.
Great. Thank you, Lucille. Mike, Armand, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Lucille, listening to you there, because it's quite a North American view in the sense of when I kind of look at the kind of China and the role. I mean, I've been talking with clients for many years about China plus one, about looking at where you want to go. And I think at the end of the day, what drives that, right? Obviously, there's the politics of it, and that's not that's out of our control. But it comes down to that cost and the resilience and agility you want to put into your supply chain. And I think COVID really woke up a lot of individuals to supply chain. And yes, it's in the touch wood, it's in the back mirror, but it's sticking around as a topic, this agility and resilience. It's not disappearing as it has in the past. And I think that's where the conversation goes. So I kind of don't look at it in a country per se view. It's almost kind of, right, what are we trying to achieve with the supply chain? Right, we're trying to minimize risk, right, and we're also trying to drive it at a certain cost or whatever cost to serve. It's then, what's the supply chain I need, and where can I get whatever it is I need in my supply chain? And it's becoming a lot more educated on that. And that's where technology is helping us really advance that, because you're able to quickly engage a lot quicker around the supply chain and potential suppliers. You're able to quickly get them on board, and you're quickly able to then start to look at it and assess it. So I kind of look at it as, when I was looking at the trends, yes, there are things like the China, there's the things like the Suez Canal, there's the wars, sadly, that are going on at the moment across the Middle East and what have you. But I think the point for me is, what am I trying to do with my supply chain, and let that be a major factor of then how I'm going to set up that supply chain and that network to then service my customers.
Hey, thank you. We have time for one more, then I'm going to wrap it up. Do you see a focus on master data evolution to prop up this type of tech as part of big data? You think, Armand, maybe you could tackle that one?
Well, I see the discussion now in the chat, and I love the discussion. I also, why we're doing this is to get more people involved thinking about these trends, and that's what's happening now in the chat. So that's great. So I think the salient point is indeed that yes, we talk a lot about digitization, AI, but the core going back is, do we have enough and clean data to begin with? And sometimes sourcing that data goes throughout your supply chain as well. So it's not just within your own organization that you have a challenge of getting the house in order. You do the housekeeping first, but then you have to bring in suppliers and customers to make, if you think about connectivity across the supply chain work, and if you have large scale applications like AI, then I think that's why we're looking at trends here. It's nowhere near maturity, I think.
Thank you, Armand. I see more questions and I would love to ask them all. We could probably go for hours, but we don't quite have the ability to do that, and I want to be respectful of the panel's time. And as you said, Armand, I'm seeing great discussion in the chat. I do want to thank a couple people that asked some really good, engaging questions. Carl Bushman, I hope I'm saying your name right. You provided some great questions that sparked some good discussion. And Katie Fowler, of course, asking some really good questions and really massaging the discussion. If you want to be a part of developing these trends, the next round will kick off in about late January, early February. Shoot me an email, research@ascm.org. You're welcome to be a part of the subcommittee that puts this together. Let's wrap up, maybe from each of you. I might be putting you on the spot, and it's a little different from your so what. But what could companies do with these trends? Mike, I'm going to start off with you.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat here, and I'm kind of smiling because around some of the AI points, because I think, you know, where are we going is, I think it's the kind of looking at these in the sense of what you're doing within your supply chain and assessing yourself in the sense of what are those priorities is probably the key thing that's kind of playing on my mind at the moment. I think trend-wise, it always changes. It's ambiguous in the basis of what's filling the newspapers, what are we responding to, what are we reacting to. But I think if you look at the 10 and kind of try to then work through, well, what elements of this could be game changers for me, and which bits of this, you know what, I'll keep an eye on them and I'll look at them in later times. I mean, I've sat in some of the stuff around AI recently where there's a lot of AI bashing going on, but there's also a lot of, forgive me for saying, but a lot of ignorance around what AI is and what it's not. And, you know, to think we've all got an answer, you know, I think that's a thing that's going to evolve in that little area. But I think it's also, right, what do you actually need to run your supply chain? And I always go back to that in all my conversations around what is it, the capabilities you need that will then drive differentiation. Because, you know, a lot of times it's around ERP. Well, ERP is, it's a record of transaction, right? It's important and it's crucial and it's got the master data. But then it's what do you want to do with that? And then what is that going to differentiate? So I think for me, this is a kind of stop in time, but it continues to evolve. And as Matt said, you know, we're constantly looking at this and things are going up and down, and it's more giving us a view right now. This is what it's looking like. I imagine next year, number 2 as an example, will probably maybe split out a bit, because a lot of conversations that are starting to happen in my neck of the woods are around tariffs. And it's that kind of, well, how do we keep on top of all this? I hope that helps, Matt.
Yeah, for sure. And again, as you were talking, more great feedback directly from what you said in the chat, Mike. Lucille, what do you think companies could or should do with these trends?
I'll simplify mine. So these top trends, again, to me, are important information or alerts for us to keep in the forefront of our business strategy. So it's important for organizations to hold on to what we learned over the past, maybe at the least 5 years, and weave this into planning your strategy for the coming year or even years. Because with everything that we're seeing, it's going to be challenging, but also it's going to be interesting. There will be a lot of opportunities.
And thank you, Lucille. Chair Armand, you have the advantage of having a few minutes to think about your answer to that question. What could companies or should companies do with these
Well,
trends?
I'd just like to lean on what Mike said earlier, and that is, don't consider this as, oh, other people are doing this and therefore I should be thinking about this. Your locus of control should be your organization and your supply chain, the things you want to see materialize. And then you can go back and start to see, okay, so if a quite substantial group of people has dug into things and they've dug up a couple of aspects, we see it's going to happen not today. We're not saying that these trends are all there yet, but in the near future, there's potential that this will impact your supply chain. Then your view on your organization's future can guide you in picking and choosing which are the most important topics, trends here for you. And a word of caution there is that just picking one out, you will see that if you take one thing out, other things will be drawn in as well. So these are interlinked. But again, going back to also what we said, the challenge for us is to design a supply chain that is future ready, and the trends can help us identify the aspects that we need to take in consideration making that supply chain future ready.
Great way to wrap up, Armand. Panel, thank you for fielding questions for almost an hour. And most importantly, thank you for your work in putting these trends together. And I look forward to working with you again when we start up again in 2020, in February, January 2026. Again, you could find the full report on ascm.org. You could also find it in the chat here. It's been posted a few times. Thank you, audience, and thank you very much, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.